when you weigh these, they're not nearly as heavy as those two.
Yeah, I was thinking, I know they hold to that it's a conflated text. I just wondered if they all hold that it's not an officially, like, church council conflated text.
Yeah, basically, this is viewed as ecclesiastical text, yeah. Yeah.
My other question, and this may get ahead of you, but the papyri. These guys, I think, say that the papyri somehow back up the Alexandrian thing. So what's going on in their minds? How does the papyri in their minds justify this? How does that factor in?
Yeah, the papyri are usually so fragmentary, right? Are so fragmentary, but there's going to be evidences of the papyri that would fit, theoretically by their notion in any one of those, categories. So I don't know that I don't think we can group all of the papyri evidence specifically as to this or this family. But they do give witness. They do give witness. And this is, and again, I don't want to get ahead of myself too much here, but when you factor in, and this view puts little emphasis upon the patristic evidence, right? Looking just at these manuscripts. But those of us that hold to the majority text will put some more weight upon the patristic evidence, because the patristic evidence very, very often patristic writings dated earlier than these, all right? Dated earlier than B and what have you. And very often they express readings that are supposedly late, you see. This is why I say the emphasis has to be on the older reading and not the oldest manuscript. And the patristic evidence very often will give us evidence of that older reading, because there was no game being played there, right? They weren't being copied and copied and copied and copied. So it's very important evidence. Okay? All right, now that is the genealogical method in a nutshell. Now, the majority text. Now, here, let me make this. This is to me interesting too. Before we go any further, again, we start playing with numbers, and this sounds. Therefore, this is bad. All right. That these manuscripts. I mean, after all, this one is called Vaticanus. All right. That ought to raise up eyebrows, right now. And that was found in a monastery. So that raises suspicion right off the bat, right? Be that as it may. When you look at the TR, Textus Receptus, the actual edition, right, from which the King James was translated. The TR, the received text, agrees with this. What do we want to call this? The genealogical text, the critical text is often called. Well, for now, I'll call it the critical text. Agrees with the critical text in 93% of the places. Right? So do I completely? No. 93% agreement. I'll go ahead and give you the data here. When I come to compare the received text with the majority text, %, agreement. So you look at it from that standpoint, and we talk about preservation here. You take the very worst, you take the worst manuscript. What's the worst manuscript you can think of? B. All right? You take the very worst manuscript that you can think of and compare that with whatever you think the best manuscript is. And You know, it's about 95%. Where the very worst manuscript is going to be exactly the same as what you regard as the very best manuscript. Talk about preservation, you see. Talk about preservation. But you say there's still that 5%. Well, okay, can we handle the 5%? Yeah, we can. But I don't want to throw that out with the wash, you see. We need to be very, very cautious here. And we'll look at some of the key places that are always put out as, places where they're undermining authority and what have you. Okay, that's the genealogical method. The other principal view here that I'm going to be arguing for is the majority text. All right, that the majority witnesses, the majority of witnesses. Now, it too is based on a presupposition. All right, it's based upon a presupposition. And I do have a little handout here that can follow along. And I think there's enough for everybody here now. That will give you the basic details of what I want to say here. The premise that we're going to be using is this: that the text which has prevailed from the early church in its various locations has every legitimate claim to be regarded as the true text. That's the presupposition. That the ecclesiastical text, if I can put it in those terms, the text of the early church in its various locations has every legitimate claim to be regarded as the true text. Bergen, who was the contemporary antagonist to Westcott and Hort, used the phrase Catholic antiquity. Catholic antiquity. Universal. All right, you know how Catholic is being used there. Universal antiquity. Many of the same arguments, and this is to me, I think, a significant observation from, at least as I try to analyze what's going on here. Many of the same arguments that we use in the establishing of the canon, I think, are appropriate and applicable in the establishing of the text. Okay? Many of the same arguments used for the establishing of the canon apply to the establishing, if you will, of the text. Books canonical immediately upon their composition, if they're inspired. But having said that, nonetheless, when there was controversy, all right, and there seemed to be, until you start having guys that were questioning which books were canonical. The church didn't address it, all right? But when the issue came forth, and when you start having the controversy, then you start having church councils. You have Carthage, and you have Laodicea Council, that dealt now with the issues of the canon. What were some of the criteria that were used as the church now? As the church doesn't determine. The church did not determine the canon. Words mean something here. The church did not determine the canon. The church recognized the canon. All right? The church recognized the canon. There were votes taken. They looked at various tests, right? The apostolic origin and the universal acceptance, and you remember all those little things that you read in NTI as to the basis. The church and they took votes. They took votes. There were some books that were disputed, the Antilegomena. They took votes. how can I say this? Those votes were rigged, right? Those votes were rigged by the throne of heaven, all right? As God manipulated and assured then that the church, the keys of the kingdom given to the church, right? And now the church recognizes those canonical books against the heretics and what have you. Church sanctioned. Now I submit to you that many of the same arguments that were used in the establishing of the canon, I think are appropriate as well for the recognition of the original text. We know that the church is given. The church is given that they're the receptacle. Yeah, in one sense, can I compare it, to this? We know that Israel, you look at what Paul says concerning Israel in Romans chapter 9, of whom are the Israelites, was given to them what? The law, the covenants, right? And concerning the flesh, through whom Christ came. But Israel, in the Old Testament dispensation, was ordained by God to be the protectors, to be the recipients, to be the preservers of that special revelation, right? It was given to Israel. Well, what Israel is then, the church is now certainly. And I think I can argue that God has given within to the church His Word for its preservation and for its promulgation and for its... All right, so if you make that comparison. So this is what Bergen was arguing, what I'm arguing here, then, that the Catholic antiquity, the text that was used in the churches, in the widest possible area, has every legitimate claim to be regarded as the true text. Now, I reject the notion of families of manuscripts. What often happens among those even that hold to the majority text, I hear talk like this. Here's the Alexandrian text, and there's the Western text, and there's the Caesarean text, and here's the Byzantine text. I hear so often, no, you critical guys, you Alexandrian cult guys, you see, you follow that. We follow that. As soon as I say I prefer the Byzantine manuscript, I have fallen into the same stinking trap. You with me? You know, understand? You see? All now we're saying, yeah, families of manuscripts. Community of origin, community of reading. As soon as I say, now it's just a matter of which do you prefer? You prefer that one, I prefer this one. No. I reject the whole notion. I reject the whole notion of talking about these families of manuscript. Can I talk about where the manuscripts were discovered? Yeah. When? Yeah. I recognize, that the Byzantine Empire was the source of many of these documents, manuscripts, but that's to be expected. The Byzantine Empire, 4th century to 15th century or so. The Eastern division of the Roman Empire was comprised primarily of Greek-speaking peoples. Whereas in the West, Latin became. So I'm not surprised then that in this region I have Greek manuscripts that are being produced. You see. I don't have Greek manuscripts being produced in the West because Greek wasn't spoken. They weren't copying. This was tedious process. You're going to copy a Greek manuscript when nobody in the world can read it. All right? Now the Latin is going on. All right? So I'm not surprised that I don't have the long tradition taking place in the western regions. Greek was no longer being spoken there. But where Greek was being spoken, now we have the continuation of that text. And certainly the overwhelming majority, I don't deny the fact that the overwhelming majority of Greek manuscripts come from that region, 90% or so. 90% or so. But that's not surprising. And the few manuscripts available to Erasmus and the other competitors for the publication of the Greek text, not surprising. Not surprising. They're in the West. They're in the West. And in the Renaissance period here, one of the components, if you will, of the Renaissance in terms of scholarship, in terms of, was to get back to the originals, right? Not just in terms of the Bible, everything we're talking about. So here's this Renaissance period connected with the Reformation. Back to the originals. Back to the originals. So this is why the great emphasis here upon getting a Greek Testament. That's the original. Let's get back to the original. Well, where are the originals going to come from? You couldn't go down to the German library and pick. No, they weren't in the West. And so the documents, the Greek manuscripts that they had available came from the East. Came from the East. And the ones that came to them, obviously, were from that particular area, and it's not surprising then. It's not surprising that the manuscripts, therefore, in the providence of God, the manuscripts from which the King James Version ultimately was translated, based upon a Greek edition that reflects the Greek text that God, through the church, had preserved. Remarkable. Remarkable. So we look at this not as a family of manuscripts, but we look at this area here that in the where Greek was, this is where the texts were copied. All right? Where the texts were copied. And preserved. Witnesses, indeed, are to be counted. Now, the Renaissance and Islam forced the Western interest, I say, in the manuscripts, and this is where they came from. And not, I say, surprising. Okay, now, with that basic assumption, all right, that the text that is used with its oldest universal application has every right to be regarded as the true text. All right, now here are the pieces of evidence, and you can follow along on the sheet that I've given to you there. Here are the pieces of evidence. Antiquity. The antiquity not just of a single ancient witness, but to the whole body of ancient authorities. Not just the antiquity of a single ancient witness, but to the whole body of ancient authorities. It's what Bergen called consent with concert. Consent with concert. And here the patristic evidence then is going to be significant. Very often the church fathers reflect a text type that by manuscript dating would be late. Very often the church fathers, the patristic evidence, bears witness to a reading that, if I just go by the date of Greek manuscripts, would be regarded as a late reading. But it bears witness to a text, to a reading that really was much older. So I want to put all the evidence. It's not just these Greek manuscripts, but now the patristic evidence, the consent with concert, as a reflection of the age. Number two, the number or consent of witnesses. The widespread consent as to location and time becomes important testimony. The Catholic antiquity. How widespread was this? How widespread? And when we now plug in the ancient versions, even with the Vulgate and whatever, there's going to be that affinity to what we know as the majority witness. The variety of evidence or Catholicity. The variety of evidence or Catholicity. The witnesses of different kinds from different places, among which there could have been no collusion. Now that's just the opposite idea of the genealogical method. Community of origin reflects, or community of reading reflects community of origin. But what this is arguing is that when I have right across this wide geographical range readings that are the same, where it would have been impossible to copy that one from this one. See? Look at the widespread, the Catholic, the universal aspect of it. Evidence of no collusion. Evidence, therefore, of the original text. The weight or respectability of witnesses. The weight or respectability of witness, the credibility of witnesses judged by their performance, not the critic's preconceived judgments. All right? As soon as a critic finds that a manuscript, oh, that looks like Byzantine, it's dismissed. It's dismissed because it's part of that family. And that's held. Now, in the majority text theory, as I employ it anyway, I'm looking and concerned about the majority witness. And I'm not going to fall prey to this family stuff, you see. I'm not going to fall prey to this family stuff. I'm looking at every witness is to be evaluated for its own merit, for its own value. And let's say I come to be, and you understand that in most places, in well over 90%, 95% maybe, B is going to be part of what? Part of the majority text. All right? In any particular reading that I look at, I'm concerned about the readings, the majority readings here. Not text types, not text families. Majority reading. In the majority of readings that I'm going to be examining, B is going to be part of the majority witness. I'm not going to play that game of preferring this family over that family or that family. A witness is a witness. A witness is a witness to the text. Can I recognize that maybe that came from Alexandria? Sure, fine. It's got to be found someplace. All right? Got to be found someplace. But not in terms of, you understand what I'm saying? To me, that's crucial. And I find so many who hold to my view that are just playing the game. Well, I prefer Byzantine because that's where the most of it is. Every witness. The weight or respectability of witnesses, not judged by the critic's preconceived judgments. The continuity or unbroken tradition. Genuine readings have left traces through the entire history of the church. For a reading to appear suddenly in the Middle Ages would be spurious. For a reading to be discovered after centuries would suggest it to be spurious. Discovery does not equal preservation. All right? Discovery does not equal preservation. continuity, the unbroken witness. The unbroken witness. So as I look at the scope of that particular reading throughout the history of the church, and now all of a sudden, it's not till the 19th century that we have a manuscript discovered that we date to the 4th century, and lo and behold, it's got something different. Pardon the language, but that ain't preservation. All right? That's discovery. All right? Discovery does not equate to preservation. But the idea, well, look, we discovered that it's dates, and so therefore, no, that's not preservation. I want to see an unbroken tradition. An unbroken tradition. And for a reading to fall out of use, all right, for a reading to fall out of use, even though it may be witnessed in a very early manuscript, all I say is, well, look at that. All right, look at that. But it's not a temptation to make that now, because I want the unbroken. Preservation is unbroken. You with me here? It's unbroken. Same thing if I find something now in one of those that is added. Well, all I can say is added. It's not preservation. All right, so that to me is a crucial, looking for the continuity or the unbroken tradition. Context or evidence from the entire passage. Any reading that is obviously a contradiction can't be genuine. It can't mean what it can't mean. Right. Bottom line. So there is a sense the intrinsic probability that's being employed here. But more objectively, right, from the standpoint that it's you can't have a contradiction of ideas. And the internal evidence or reasonableness. This is concerned principally with matters of grammar, logic, geography, science. These are more objective matters than this simple intrinsic probability idea. But you put all that together. All right, you put all that together. There are logical reasons, and I can hold that without undermining the other, without accusing somebody. But it's based upon a presupposition. If the premise that I'm giving here is not accepted, then these arguments don't make any sense. They're not legitimate. If I reject the premise of the genealogical method, as I do, their arguments are not legitimate. It boils down to the presuppositions. Now, is it a matter of biblical doctrine which of those two premises I hold? Not really. Not really. They both are flowing from and are related to a desire of the individual to get back to the inspired text. It's not denial. The genealogical method does not deny inspiration. It does not. It does not deny preservation. It does not. It simply seeks to identify what's been preserved in a different way than I would prefer. The way my head works, right, which we know is impeccably logic, sees the sensibility of the majority text assessment. And I say in the providence of God, when the King James Version was being translated, 17th century, it was based on a Greek edition. Now, those translators didn't have all these manuscripts available. Many of the manuscripts that are now available to us were still in the dirt when the translators were working. But I say in the providence of God, the manuscripts that were used by Erasmus and Stephanus and Beza, creating this what became ultimately known as the received text, represented what we now know to be the majority text witness of the New Testament scriptures and of the English versions. that are in use today. Geneva Bible would be the same, right? But we don't. I've got a Geneva Bible that antedates the King James, was the principal competitor. You know, the King James ultimately supplanted the Geneva Bible for various political reasons. King James hated the Geneva Bible because of its notes, all right? Because of its notes, particularly that were, you know, against the monarchy and what have you. And the Puritans rejected the King James Version, all right? Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible is what came on the Mayflower, all right? What came on the Mayflower. And one of the stipulations in the writing of the King James you can't have any notes, all right? You aren't going to be messing with no notes. Fine. There was intrigue in whatever else going on, but in the providence of God, here is a translation now that reflects and that has affected the world linguistically. You know, how much of speech, even of everyday speech, is reflecting language that is supposed to be so archaic that we don't know. People use it without knowing that it's coming from the King James Bible. Whole list of idioms. You look at Bartlett's list of quotations and how many came from the. It's remarkable. Everyday speech. It affected language. So are we looking for a translation that affects culture and has affected, or do we want a translation that is affected by the oddities of culture? See? But that's getting to the translation aspect. I'll say more about that tomorrow. Okay, let's take a little break here, and I'll come back and give some specific examples, and then we'll call it quits there. Any questions before we shut this off now? Yes, sir.
So is received text or King James is they use the majority approach?
They use what ultimately became known as the Textus Receptus, the received text, that was based upon a half a dozen or so manuscripts that so happened to reflect the majority witness. So I can almost equate, not completely equate, but I can almost equate the TR with the majority text. All right? Almost equate it. Not completely, but we can almost equate it. So of modern versions, it's as close as we have. There's no modern version that translates anything close. All right? And the New King James is based on the same text as the King James. So it's only those two that are based on this text tradition.
So when I say I prefer majority text, and then, but we don't have any translation from majority text, so the bad thing.
As close as we have will be the received text. The received text is 98% of what the majority text would be. Yes. And we're talking just very, very minuscule things.
I'm sorry, in that case, so
Yes.
we compromise or we...
Don't compromise. If there comes a place where I prefer the majority text, and you have to have, you know, if I hold a majority text, I hold a majority text. And in those few places where the TR would disagree with it, you know, I recognize that. And in preaching, I've done this often. The text more literally says blank.
So as a preacher or pastor, so we compare majority text and King James, and then if we find any variance between them,
If that's your, you have to hold the majority text. Now there are going to be some that say, no, I want to hold the received text everywhere. Fine, go for it. Go for it. I think that's less defensible. But if that's what you choose, then do it. But it's going to be minuscule, all right? And, you know, I look at it. I look at it, and you make the, the statement. I'm not going to give a lecture on textual criticism. I'm not going to get up in a pulpit and say, hey, that word's not really in the Greek text, or blank, blank, blank. You can get the, you can get the idea without going through all of the. You don't want to show people any exegetical point. I don't show them all the dirt under my fingernails. How I got to where I got. You just give them the. But no, I don't see it as a compromise at all. Not at all. Okay? All right, we'll take one more break here, then we'll